Hi there, my name is David Robert Lewis. I'm a writer, published writer, media activist, activist at large, and I've got a background in the struggle press. I've written and worked for some of the alternative titles that were around during the late 80s, early 90s, and I've got a degree in English from University of Cape Town, and I've also written and worked for some of the more mainstream newspapers. I studied law in 1987, so I got into law school. I dropped out of law school because I was shot at by the South African police. They tear-gassed UCT campus, sjambocked pregnant women. The campus was closed down, there were sit-ins, and I was part of the student revolts at that time, and that's one of the reasons I actually dropped out of law. And I started writing for the South. I became a member, joined the Congress of South African Writers. I was going through a bit of a revolt. Yeah, well, this was after they banned the End Conscription campaign in '87 as well. So all of that sort of breezed over us. We were just forced, essentially, to create a new society. And I was engaged to a Muslim girl, beautiful Muslim girl, actress from Retreat. That sort of never transpired. We never actually married. But it opened doors for me. I mean, she had gone for military training in Zimbabwe. Her father was a member of Qibla. I got to meet people like Farid Isak. Ibrahim Rasool, for instance, sponsored the magazine that I was an editor on. And we published L.B. Sachs, an article about L.B. Sachs.
Right.
At that point, he was just a terrorist. He'd been blown up, and he'd lost his arm. And he became the head of the Constitutional Court. I mean, for me, that's the great story, is the fact that people came from such ordinary, extraordinary places, but they were, the change was set from a person being banned. Virtually no one knew about him because they'd erased the memory. I mean, they'd erased Nelson Mandela. Right. I mean, no one knew what he looked like. And I'd gone up to campus when I was at school doing a history project, and I'd looked through the card catalogue, and these books are not long road to free. I want to read that. And I went to the librarian. The librarian says to me, well, that the fact that you've requested this book means I've got to now put you on a list. And you're not allowed to read this book. It's a banned book, and you've got to get permission from the head of the security branch, or the Minister of Safety and Security. And you can only get permission if you are a very special person, if you're writing a PhD. And then there's this whole sort of restriction of to actually get the book, it's sort of under lock and key, and someone's got to haul it out of a prison or a safe or something, and be there with you while you read the book. So there was this KGB sort of scenario, and that sort of opened my eyes a lot. So I published people like L.B. Sachs, Michael Cope, and possibly, my namesake, David Lewis Williams, was a professor, and he was known for, he had sort of done a bit of stuff in rock art. I was the person who popularized the cause of the San. In fact, the magazine was a sort of a bastardization of the Gehenna, which is one of the lower hells of the Jewish mythology, and Kachen, which is the
trickster deity of the Hong San.
Right.
So this was like in those days of there was this transition period of end of the 80s. We'd gone through this enormous repression. People had been banned. The conscription campaign had been banned. I was a member of the United Democratic Front. I was writing for South. The circles I was in, Farid Isaac, Ibrahim Rasool, Sanili Dikeni. We had Bush Radio. Before Bush Radio was Bush Radio, it was distributed on cassette. And all the cassettes were illegal because the Freedom Charter was banned. If you wore a Freedom Charter T-shirt, you could be locked up. And anyway, so I interviewed Edric Gorfinkel, is no longer with us, and Sandeli when they were setting up the Bush Radio project, and then it became this very successful community radio station. So this was like first green consciousness kind of magazine. And I was like one of the first people to write anything about the sustainable, the cause of the Brundtland Commission. I mean, they'd come up with this report called Our Common Future, and this is where they defined sustainable development. And that was then carried forth by, this is where Ibrahim Rasool got his whole super thing about let's have a World Summit on Sustainable Development. We got the summit. But I've criticised. I'm not a conformist. I've criticised sustainable development as being just one of those labels you can attach to anything, and if you depending on your perspective, sort of comics. And this is quite cool. This is Prophets of the City. Before they were Prophets of the City, there was this African hip hop movement, and Ready D was just Dion Daniels, I think it was. And they actually performed at each magazine there would be a launch party for each particular edition. It was like each one was unique, and I just remember they were like, well, you can call me Ready D, is it Ready A, or is it Ready B or Ready C? No, it's Ready Ready D, and a bit sort of nervous about, well, is this my name or not, kind of thing. So that's just the story of hip hop. And here's the crazy thing. We'll talk about the Media 24. So I had this story because of my connections with the hip hop movement. There's this group called Dritzvinger, and it's actually just a one rapper rapping in Afrikaans. And I thought, well, here's something. Surely a Media 24 Afrikaner company will be interested in these guys, and they're from the Cape Flats, and here's a cool story. But no, they're not interested in the hip hop because hip hop is associated with drugs. This is the editor's directive, is that the club culture and the hip hop and all this kind of stuff, it's too associated with sex and drugs, and I dare say that they would probably feel the same thing about rock and roll, that rock and roll is work of Satan.
Yes.
That kind of attitude. So it's sort of Mother Grundyism and South. Maybe just work for this is Top of the Times. This is my story. So I've got stories for the Top of the Times. Another one. times. So I've been published by people.
That's no reason why it shouldn't be again.
Yeah, so I get public. What's happened is I seem to be getting more censored than I was when I was banned.
Okay.
This is the irony. I'm more censored now than I was when I was banned. When I was banned, I was being published by South, and there was the struggle alternative newspapers. So there was this alternative.
Right.
Now that I'm not banned, I'm being censored and gagged. So add that up. Has anything changed? No, things have gotten worse because I'm gagged, censored, and I'm not getting published. The stories that I want to write aren't being published because there is no alternative because of the mainstream press because the press has been corporatized and boardroom decisions being what they are. Lowest common denominator prevails. So we don't rock the boat. We'd rather not have conflicts about the jazz in the townships. The Alternative Media Forum was something that was started after I was gagged by Media 24. Media 24 is possibly one of the largest media companies in Southern Africa. They're active on the continent. They're actually based overseas. They were listed on the NASDAQ last time I checked. And I was employed by the Community Papers division. And I wrote a story about a black jazz musician. And because of my background, I crossed the colour line back in the 80s.
Right. Was it a South African jazz musician?
Yes. This is the problem. Is that there's this perception that certain races are associated with certain neighbourhoods or communities. And because of the segregation of the past, we have these problems where there was the Group Areas Act enforced, and people were forced to live in certain areas. And the community papers were published in what were formerly known as coloured group areas. And I had a background publishing and writing for South Press, which was distributed in those areas. So the people in those areas actually know me. I've got a long history and relationship with many of the people in those areas, such as Athlone, Lansdowne, Grassy Park, Manenberg, and so on. And in fact, the reason I joined the struggle was because of the jazz, because I wanted to listen to people like Dollar Brand, also known as Abdullah Ibrahim,
yes.
and there was, because segregation was enforced, a lot of these musicians weren't allowed to play in white areas, and there was this move, a lot of alternative events where we'd get musicians from the townships and we'd bring them together with whiteys from the suburbs, and there'd be this sort of integration in defiance of the government's laws, segregating and separating people. So, on the one hand, you can say I'm a victim of the system. I'm also a victim of the success of having crossed those boundaries, being in a situation where now you have a company which was all white, completely segregated up until late 80s. Under P.W. Botha's tricameral parliament, they went and diversified. That's the time when they went and acquired a stake in Mnet.
Right.
And, you could argue, well, there was a bit of a kickback going on, and they also bought Jane Faley and Associates. Right. I'm sitting with a letter from the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development of the Republic of South Africa, the TRC unit, from a Dr. Mochibelo Siku, Officer, the Chief Operations Officer. And as far as he can tell, Nationale Pers, or NASPERS, did not make any submissions to the TRC. This is the company which is also known as Media 24.
Right.
Instead, they provided the TRC with a copy of Urgrense Hien, the official history of Naspers. And that is where their participation ended, although certain journalists did make submissions in their individual capacity. And I'd sent a letter asking them about the status of the company under the Act. And their response was, in respect of your question relating to the legal status of Naspers under the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act of 1995, the unit is currently looking into this matter. It is therefore expected that a response will be forwarded as soon as possible. I've subsequently, I've actually just written a letter now asking them, has anything transpired since the last response from the unit?
And that was how long ago?
This was a letter received on the 28th of September 2006.
Right.
Right. So I was now employed by their community papers, and I wrote a jazz story. Unfortunately, I don't actually have the original story now with me. I think I gave it to Jonathan Shapira has it now. But their copy is all over the place.
And did Jonathan say he'd do anything more with it?
I'm not sure what he's going to do about it. Jonathan and I actually worked in the same paper. He started off as a cartoonist for South, and then he became quite big. He started being published by Mail and Guardian, and now he's very mainstream.
Sunday Times.
Sunday, he's everywhere. He's in every sort of media company. So I wrote an article about a jazz musician. And the editor of the People's Post, Annalene Dean, says to me, no, this story's not local enough. There's sort of issues with the story that she has. And I sort of understood what her point was, that perhaps there was this perception that Jimmy Gludlu, I don't have a picture here of him, that Jimmy Gludlu is an immigrant from Mozambique, and perhaps there's a perception that he's a foreigner, and also that it's more of a national story because it was a story about the fact that he'd won the Sama Award for Best Jazz Album. All right. So it's a perception that maybe this is a national story, it's not a local story. Now, this is despite the fact that he's a UCT College graduate from the College of Music, and he's a resident of Pinelands. He actually has a residence in Pinelands. So irrespective of whether he's from Mozambique or he's a resident or whatever it is, as my feeling was that this was a newsworthy story, and that there was a community angle. So I went back and I thought, well, let's try and focus the story more and find the community angle. Is it the fact that he's from the UCT College of Music? Is it the fact that he's a resident of Pinelands? And the community angle that I found was to interview a local jazz maestro, a man by the name of Robbie Jansen, who's the Cape Guma king. He's been around for many years. He's very well established. He lives in the target market of the paper's concern. There's no arguing that what Robbie Jansen has to say isn't now talking to those communities. Right. So I interviewed Robbie Jansen about the fact that Jimmy Gludlu had won the Sama Award and that Robbie had been nominated for a Sama.
Okay.
And he had a lot of very interesting things to say. And the response from the editor was, no, this is now too controversial because now Robbie is, maybe he's dissing the Sama Awards. He said they're the Sema Sua Awards. It's not a popularity contest. It's how many records you sell. But it's, for me, even though maybe there was a bit of Skinner sort of involved, and it was, for me, a very entertaining story that broke from the sort of stereotypes that one has of these musicians. Very often what we only get are the press releases of the record labels' view of what these people are, and I was trying to humanize. I'd sort of, I'd read many Robbie Jansen stories. Working at the Cape Times, I mean, Sandile Dukeni had commissioned or written a couple of stories about Robbie, and we published stories about Jimmy and these people. They were sort of like, it was old hat. I mean, there was nothing really new about these musicians. And here was the target market, and I thought, well, we could do something more interesting and creative and humanize and give a sort of more of a backyard, homegrown sense of these are real life people living in these communities with things to say, faced with real issues, and how can we break from those stereotypes that have been generated as a result of the apartheid system, where you have this division and segregation and essentially playing to a white audience. Right. So I thought we could do something quite creative and interesting. Unfortunately, the editor was from Bloemfontein and had a very different view about how the world works. As far as she was concerned, there were very strict categories of people. A black person, for instance, wasn't of any interest to the target market. So no matter what a coloured musician says or does, this was a coloured target market, and a black person had no reason to be talked about in that target market.
Surely these are people who have talents and they would be looked up to by those
surely
markets?
10 years after democracy, this is a debate that one shouldn't be having in a newsroom.
No, of course.
This is something, racial profiling, as far as I'm concerned, is a form of discrimination. And I've made allegations of racial profiling to the Human Rights Commission. I've made the allegation to the Labour Court, and I'm still sitting here now 12 months later without any action on the part of the legal fraternity to pursue this case. My labour insurance was repudiated on the basis that I am at fault for not conforming to a coloured target market. I complained to the manager of the VP Courant, the Nationale Pers. Complained to the manager, and his response was to schedule an evaluation meeting in which my contract and performance would be evaluated. So I sat there waving my article about Jimmy Dludu while I was now being evaluated. And they were very unhappy with my performance.
But the two things have nothing to do with each other.
I couldn't find the connection. So here's the human resources manager, the editor, and the manager of the division. And now we're talking across purposes, because I'm saying, well, I'm sorry, under no circumstances am I prepared to pursue this relationship any further unless we sort out this story about Jimmy Dludu and Robbie Jansen. And they say to me, well, you know, we're unhappy with your performance, and if you're going to take that attitude, you can take your things and leave right now.
But your performance in which way? About writing the article? Nothing else about your performance?
They raised all sorts of issues. They said, this is, I mean, I can quote from the human resources person, said, "What am I doing on a Friday night at the West End talking to someone like Robbie Jansen? Aren't I contradicting myself as a Jew?"
What's that got to do with anything?
Well, you see, this is the thing, is that as far as I'm concerned, I should have been reading my Talmud and my Torah on a Friday night, and I shouldn't be writing about things that don't concern me. So there's an allegation of anti-Semitism now as well, because as far as I'm concerned, what I do on a Friday night is between me and my Friday night. So regardless of the fact that I was working a 7-day week in order to, because of this was a new title and it was being launched, and there were all sorts of labour issues that I don't really want to go into at this point. Okay, so I got very upset by this lack of understanding of the situation, lack of sensitivity to the fact that I had basically worked my way up through a struggle background, which meant I'd broken the colour line. I've been working for papers at badly paid, right? I wasn't doing this for the money. I could have gone the corporate route, worked for an all-white newspaper, but I chose to work for a coloured black newspaper. I worked for New Nation. I've written for the Vrye Weekblad. And I've worked for black editors. I've worked for Zwalaki Sisulu. I've worked for Sandile Dekani. I started writing at Grassroots. I worked for Gail Regan at Grassroots. So, despite the fact that there's insensitivity to my struggle heritage and the fact that I'm a Jew and that I am not, I don't consider myself white, and I don't consider myself, in that apartheid labeling system, and that I have relationships with people like Benny Gould and Rashid Lombard. Rashid Lombard is one of the directors, or former directors of ESP Africa. And in fact, I'd gone to see Rashid and I'd said, could I have access to some of these jazz musicians who are in the townships, and I'd like to write about the Kwela, the penny whistle players that are impoverished, and they've never been given any exposure. I mean, Robert Sitoli. I mean, as a result of me fishing around for information about the Kwela, the story about Robert Sitoli, Josh Sitoli, and all that whole thing broke in the Sunday Times. So suddenly there was this interest in our heritage, in our musical heritage, and I was driving that because I'd been involved in it, and I knew people like Steve Gordon from making music, and I had access to Lance Stair, and I'd been involved in some of these activities where we'd gotten people together in various forums. So I was exceptionally irate that after making a complaint based upon the rejection of my story on without any basis, completely groundless, just a very fickle, I thought that there was just a very petty, very fickle, narrow-minded approach to something that for me was quite sensitive and very... And
they didn't even go through a negotiation.
And there was no negotiating, it was just a sort of summary dismissal where the manager just fired me it was this old school, I must just say, Yabas. Ja meneer, nee meneer, and that's it. And I must just be cut down to size, I must know my place. So I published this pamphlet, which I distributed at the first Cape Town International Book Fair to some of the international publishers. And it reads, "Some people just don't get it. The apartheid system built upon ignorance, greed and prejudice is long gone. Unfortunately, some Naspers and Media 24 employees want to perpetuate a form of racial domination that ignores the rights of people of different faiths, beliefs and opinions. Recently, the company expanded its community newspapers in the areas of Grassy Park, Athlone, Lansdowne and Retreat. The People's Post claims to tell it as it is, but the truth is it won't be covering the jazz from Manenberg or the history of slavery at the Cape." They even threw out a story brief that I'd written about the history of slavery exhibition at the Ezekiel Museum. And to make matters worse, I mean, you think this is an example of how not to go about lack of sensitivity training.
Yeah.
This is a textbook case of what not to do in terms of in provoking angry responses from your community, your so-called target market.
Right.
Don't throw out the history of slavery story from and say to the communities who have slave histories that this history has no relevance. Don't throw out an exhibition of Islamic art at the Boerkaap Museum and say that people on the Cape Flats have no interest in what's going on in the Boerkaap, because what's happening in the Boerkaap is a separate group area from what's happening in the Cape Flats.
But it's of interest to the whole coloured community.
It's of interest to every Muslim, it's of interest to every Jew, every Christian, every person who's interested in art.
Exactly.
Surely, you say, this is art, Or this is the music, jazz, is something that is universal. It's not something that you can segregate and compartmentalize on the basis of the color of your skin, say, I'm only going to listen to black jazz or white jazz. And you're going to make a distinction on that basis. And now I complain about this, and what do? They fire me on the spot without any disciplinary hearing. So here we have, in fact, I say, they won't even cover poets who live in historically disadvantaged areas. Why? Because Naspers and Media 24 is a racist and prejudiced company. Here only for a quick buck. It has paid lip service to diversity and equality in the workplace and continues to discriminate. Please boycott Naspers and Media 24 and its affiliates, such as Via Africa, PAL Media and Educor, and demand that that their products carry a racism, sexism, prejudice-free sticker in the future. Boycott prejudice in the book trade.
Right.
You think this would arouse people's opinions and that there would be support for someone publishing such a pamphlet?
I would think so.
Right. I got absolutely no support, no material support, no support except from my own immediate network of friends.
Right.
There was no support from the publishing industry. There was no support from the media. What I got was an angry letter from Jan S. de Villiers' attorneys saying, it's come to our client's attention that you're distributing pamphlets with the following reference to our client. Because Naspers and Media 24 is a racist and prejudiced company only for a quick buck, it has paid lip service, etc., etc. And he goes on to say, the above mentioned pamphlets, and especially the paragraph quoted, exceed the parameters of fair comment and can only be described as extremely defamatory of our client. And basically they threaten me with legal action, and if I don't stop distributing this pamphlet, they're going to bring an urgent application interdicting me from doing so, and they're going to seek or pursue action for damages.
What happened to freedom of speech?
Right, what happened to freedom of speech? Okay, now this is a company that doesn't believe in non-discrimination and is willing to sacrifice freedom of expression in the process. Right, so you have a contradiction here in terms of their own hypocrisy. I had to then go to the legal aid board and plead poverty because I had absolutely no means. I haven't managed to save money. I'm bereft. So I got a pro bono assistance, and eventually, after going to the Law Society appointed Abrams and Gross to defend my freedom of expression. The case is still outstanding. No agreement or settlement has been made. I have nothing in writing indicating that the Media 24 will not pursue its action of damages against me for publishing a so-called defamatory pamphlet. So I've got the threat of a gagging order, and in fact the effect of this was essentially a gagging of me. So the effect of a this is Jan S. de Villiers with partners, there are about 40 partners, professional assistants and consultants, all willing to defend Naspers. And now I finally get a relatively small law firm to defend me. I then got support. I got support from the Freedom of Expression Institute, who then wrote a letter to Hein Brandt, Jan Malherbe, and Neil Jansen, complaining about their threat, and saying that basically they sort of objected to the tone and substance of the attorney's letter as being intimidatory and an attempt to violate the free expression of a member of the public. And that this the rights under the Section 16 of the Constitution have been upheld, numerous court judgments. And this was interesting. It said, as a media company, Africa's leading publishing group, as you refer to yourselves, you should understand the critical importance of freedom of expression in South African context, and the need to vigorously guard it from any and all sectors of our society that might seek to subvert it. It is not a right that should be undermined. certainly not by the media, whose very existence and work are dependent on the highest respect and adherence to this right. It is extremely disconcerting, therefore, that Media 24 has chosen to resort to threats, such as those contained in your attorney's letter, in order to silence a journalist, and in so doing is undermining a value and right that it should be protecting and defending. And it goes on and on and on. It's a very interesting...
and have you had any feedback from anybody as regards all these letters?
No, I've had absolutely no support from the public, from the press. This is despite sending all of this to the South African National Editors Forum, making numerous protests and attempts to get some kind of coverage of this case. Okay, so here we have the Freedom of Expression Institute, and this was sent out on their mailing list. In fact, it's in the Canadian branch of FXI. There's a international Freedom of Expression Institute, I think. So it was, the Canadians know about it, so it became an international incident from being, I always, the local is global and the global is local.
That's true.
So as a result of this whole debacle where my rights had been violated and there was just an attempt to gag me and silence me, I convened a body. We gave it a sort of a ad hoc. It was an ad hoc, informal body of supporters.
Right.
We call it the Alternative Media Forum, and anyone who is interested in freedom of expression, the rights of community journalists, and so on. If you're against racism in the media, you're more than welcome to air your views in the Alternative Media Forum, and we're trying to establish it as more of a sort of more legitimate legal entity, because there's an issue of its legal status, because we don't have a constitution as we speak. Right. So this is the one problem.
Just a question, sorry, David. As a result of them firing you, were you then able to get other work in the media?
No, I haven't had. I haven't been employed for 12 months. I'm subsisting. I don't have. I've been published recently by Biophile magazine, but that was in a completely different. It was more in my sort of views about nuclear energy. So the irony is that here's something that I really would like to be doing, is writing about the jazz. But
have you considered writing a blog online?
I had an online blog. My online, I find there's no point. It doesn't pay the rent.
No, sure
it does get you coverage. I don't need extra coverage, really. What I need is material, concrete support, not airy-fairy, oh yes, no, we support freedom of expression, but where is the nuts and bolts of this freedom that we fought for? Where's the concrete after 20 years of working in the media? Where is the concrete? The substance to these values. People talk about the values, but there's no substance. We end up basically on the street because everyone's a journalist. The level of journalism is very low. This company, I think, was employing kids with just college level education. I've got a university degree, and the English. I was subbing the English. English was very bad.
You read any newspaper today, the spelling mistakes.
Well, it's just it just becomes it's just the level of discourse, the level of debate, the level of inquiry is very low, and we've seen it. This is the problem across the board. It's not just titles. Media 24, which has a very if you look at Sari, Haskinoot and You, these are not very educated journals. These are very low level Skinner.
Yeah.
The independent group have been going the same route. Their cash cows are the Daily Voice, the Scandal, Tits and Tick and Television is essentially their bread and butter. So they're making money out of Tick, Television and Tits on a daily basis, and all the stuff around that. And there's an argument that, well, this isn't really responsible journalism. This is just not muckraking, which is the muckraking tradition of the Mail and Guardian of let's find the truth, let's uncover the truth, Newsweek, all that kind of thing. And also I think the Cape Times has, to a degree, a little bit of that. That's all gone. I mean, the struggle press no longer exists. The people who were in those positions basically sold out, became involved in positions of power and authority. So we don't have an alternative press, and this is one of my campaigns at the moment, is to raise awareness about the need for alternative opinions, alternative voices, alternative formats, and access to information. So there's also an alternative media forum at the moment has instituted an application against the independent group, partly to do with the fact that their coverage of this whole case was completely one-sided. It was completely, they'd gotten the wrong end of the stick. They started writing about the fact that I'm a Jew, that I'd threatened to sue various, that I'm an unsuccessful serial litigant. So you think there would be some kind of sensitivity and support for my predicament that I'm in as a struggle journalist, and here's the jazz story. It's part of the Labour case. This thing went to the Human Rights Commission. No, according to Corinne Breitenbach of the Cape Times, she says, a former reporter with the People's Post community newspaper has taken Media 24 to the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation, Arbitration over allegedly being dismissed unfairly. David Robert Lewis has in the past taken or threatened to take other employers in the media industry, including the Cape Times, to the CCMA without success. A former employer who did not want to be named called Lewis a serial litigator. Lewis alleges his dismissal was rooted in racial and religious intolerance. He was employed on a 3-month contract, but was dismissed after 2 months. In a demonstration outside the CCMA, there was a demonstration. Right? This is an anti-racist picket. Right? Outside the CCMA. In a demonstration outside the CCMA building yesterday, Lewis was flanked by 5 picketing members of the Cape Town Anti-War Coalition who said they were there to protest against capitalism. I don't know where she got that from. And she misquotes me. She says, Lewis claims he was forced to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week, thus being unable to celebrate the Jewish Sabbath from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. Lewis said he was dismissed without getting anything on paper after he fought for the publication of a story he wrote about a black jazz musician. So here we have a very badly concocted news report that really isn't focusing on the issue at stake, which is discrimination and this problem of a black jazz musician being denied access to the community in which he is actually a resident of Cape Town. And as far as the editor is concerned, this isn't a news story, and even if Robbie Jansen has an opinion, his opinions aren't newsworthy.
But to just be fired for one article is quite ridiculous anyway.
Yeah, no, it was very ridiculous. It was, and there were, I mean, there's several issues which in terms of their sort of prejudice. I mean, my contract was just completely ridiculous, considering my experience and all sorts of issues. But anyway, so the Cape Times wasn't very supportive. I mean, they're telling people that I'm a serial litigant. and I'm an unsuccessful serial litigant at that. I sued the Cape Times and won. I took them to the small claims court because they refused to pay for some articles that had been commissioned by one of the editors who had been was dismissed. And I've actually got a letter from Anthea Garman at the journalism department at Rhodes saying this is actually very irregular, and that the accepted practice in the industry is to, regardless of the situation of the person who's employed, if the company, if that person has a title or function in the company and commissions a piece, that they should pay for that work, regardless of what, or spike it, that kind of thing. The independent group have got a very bad track record of paying their bills.
Right.
They went through a rationalization process in 2000, and the Media Workers Association took them to court and lost. So, you know, and I don't know if you're aware of there's a report that just came out. It was commissioned, I can't remember who now, but it was, I think, one of the board members, an O'Brien. There's a report about the bad corporate governance within the company. Basically, the report accuses the Independent of crony capitalism. Essentially, the board doesn't reflect the group as a whole. It reflects a very small segment of who have hardly even a controlling interest. I mean, Tony O'Reilly, I think, controls 30% of the O'Reilly family has only 30% stake in the company. Most of the company, in fact, is in hock to the Bank of Ireland.
Oh, wow.
So the company that essentially owns the daily press in South Africa is run by the Bank of Ireland. This yeah. I mean, O'Reilly's is a straw dog. I mean, he's a straw dog. He's not. He was once a force in the media. Gavin O'Reilly, who's basically made his way in life because of the fact that he's the son of Tony O'Reilly, and he's the head of the World's Association of Newspapers. I don't know how he manages to get into such positions of power. I mean, bearing in mind that, in fact, the O'Reillys don't have a controlling interest in the company, and that the company's been accused of bad corporate ethics, and I mean, there are all sorts of issues to do with their, and I wrote a piece as well, with their relationship to Clear Channel. Clear Channel Independent are a South African entity that was set up after an agreement between O'Reilly and the head of Clear Channel. The scandal about it is that Clear Channel have been accused, because of the 911 saga, of cozying up to the Bushes, and they staged, I think, pro-war demonstrations. In fact, the head of Clear Channel was also active in Halliburton, and there's this whole problem of crony capitalism, where they've made payments to the Republican Party, they made payments to the re-elect Bush campaign. The problem with Clear Channel Independent is the fact that here you have a company with that owns public relations companies, advertising companies, with a stake in the media. Now, how much of the front page of the Cape Times is actually up for sale? Are the news stories that one reads being generated by journalists, or are they being generated by public relations people? Right. So there are all sorts of issues to do with that whole saga with the independent group. Alternative Media Forum has brought a access to information request which was denied by Tony Howard, and subsequently we've had to go to the High Court to get access to the information.
Okay.
Right. But maybe that's something to talk about at some other point.
Yeah.
What I want to sort of talk about really is now this labour case. Can one
Yes.
go there?
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, so after all this stuff happened, I ended up being referred to the Labour Court. This is from the CCMA. This is after being gagged by Media 24 for writing a jazz story.
Fired by them.
Fired. Now there's a labour dispute, there's a censorship issue, freedom of expression issue, a couple of issues, and the fact that there's no support from the press. So the independent group aren't giving me glowing editorials. No, they're actually accusing me of being a serial litigant. I'm just nothing more than a troublemaker. I've got a opinion from a senior counsel who reckons that my problem is that I don't conform to a coloured target market. In fact, my problem is I'm not coloured.
Right.
This is my problem. My problem is I'm not coloured, and what am I doing writing for a coloured newspaper?
Well, why did they employ you to write for a coloured
Why did they
newspaper?
employ me in the first place? I mean, who am I? Why did I break the law to begin with? Why did I cross the colour line? Why did I go against the apartheid system? That's my problem, isn't it? I didn't conform.
That's crazy.
And this is a legal opinion from Andrew Cage, advocate of the High Court of South Africa and Lesotho, and I've actually now written a letter of complaint because on the basis of this, my insurance was repudiated.
Joking.
I'm not a coloured and therefore I don't deserve to have insurance. I shouldn't be in a coloured target market. What am I? I'm not conforming. And according to the disclaimer on my insurance, if there are no reasonable prospects of success in such a case, right? And it's impossible to prove that they're discriminating against anti-apartheid activists and struggle journalists. Right? There's no reasonable prospects of success in a legal case of this kind, and therefore, based upon that, my legal-wise insurance doesn't have to fund my claim. They repudiated it. Right? This opinion was under review, was reiterated by one of LegalWise's own review attorneys, Jay Cosner, up in Bloemfontein. People in Bloemfontein agree wholeheartedly that if you weren't born a coloured to begin with, you have no business writing for a coloured newspaper. Right?
What do journalists do? Journalists write for any newspaper?
Apparently, if you're white, you must write for a white newspaper. While this was happening, I made a submission to the South African Human Rights Commission. And it's a detailed submission to the Human Rights Commission. Essentially, everything that I've told you now about the discrimination, about the anti-Semitism, about the Islamophobia. And there's also Islamophobia.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, anti-Semitism is xenophobia, is Islamophobia. And there's also xenophobia. I mean, xenophobia is if you discriminate against a person merely because they are an immigrant.
Exactly.
That's xenophobia. No, this is a new word that we're learning at Media 24. There's absolutely no sensitivity. I've come to the conclusion that we had an immigrant past. My family are immigrants. We immigrated in the 1700s, the one side of the family. The other side of the family, from a shtetl in Latvia, immigrated relatively early. I mean, I think they came here in the 1900s. But I have an immigrant past. We have an immigrant future. We are all immigrants.
Right.
It's very difficult to prove that you are, unless you are a member of the First Nation, you have First Nation status, that you are indigenous. So on that token, most of the Nguni tribes are also relative newcomers to the subcontinent, are now immigrants, and that we should all embrace our immigrant heritage, and that we should, because we have an immigrant future. There are 10,000 immigrants arriving in Cape Town every month. Right, from all over. Anyway, the South African Human Rights Commission took a bleak view of my submission and said no, they don't want to replicate a labour dispute if it's already been attested to or been investigated by an adequate body, legal thing. They don't want to replicate the inquiry, investigation. Right? So they're not helping matters.
Right.
They're throwing everything back, so it's all sitting at the Labour Court. And I'm sitting here, I mean, I can go into my Labour case, which is still pending. I'm stuck because I've had to now, because I don't have an attorney, because my insurance is reviewed yet. I've had to approach the Law Society to go through another means test, right? To get another firm of pro bono attorneys to essentially defend here's the thing. Media 24, you think that taking Media 24 to the Labour Court would be an easy process. No, they turned around and objected to the case.
On what grounds?
There's a notice. There are all these they've taken exception to the case, as say it's vague and embarrassing for one or more, all of the following reasons. So now there's got to be a pre-trial in which the merits of whether or not there is, and I am on the defensive. I am having to defend my right to take Media 24 to Labour Court, right? Which was shocking.
Shocking.
So I said, well, and then I was quite willing to defend myself, to take this to Labour Court myself. But if I'm now on the defensive, having to defend my right to even be there, it's something that's an impossible task, bearing in mind that they've got 20, 40, 50, 60 attorneys on their side. Right. It's not going to happen. I have to get...
Plus the fact that you are not able to work for any of the media because of...
Plus the fact that I can't work because my status is now pending. There's a labour dispute. There's allegations of I'm a serial litigant. I'm just a bad egg. I'm not conforming to the coloured target market. And that is the status quo, and I'm rocking the boat, and I'm a bad person. I am at the point where I have to seek legal assistance, and the process takes forever.
All the legal process do take forever.
They take forever. They initially said no. They would try and get my attorney that had filed the initial filing sheet, and this is the initial. I just want to give you an example of what's in this filing sheet, just to give you an example of what this case is about. Statement of the facts that we relied on to establish evidence came. At Media 24, a system / policy exists in terms of which it caters to and maintains previously segregated areas by printing newspapers that comply with racial profiling and thus uphold racial divisions. And the above discriminates against the applicant and that inter alia compliance with him with the above policy is contrary to his religious and political views. So there's an allegation that essentially there's a system of policy or system of segregation at Media 24. I can testify to the fact that if you walk into the